Eine jüdische Frechheit hat länger gelebt als ihm du.
We believe that the Nazis and the fascists have asked for it, and they're going to get it.
In the statistics of the Reich, they were referred to as enemy companies with American shareholders. In the war, there were 553 of them, including such well-known names as Coca-Cola, Kodak, and American Express. Yet, very few of them were enemies. Some had close contacts to the Nazis. In the case of 4 large American companies and their German subsidiaries, Hitler was even able to regard the bosses as friends. Without them, he would not have been able to wage war. They saw him as the man who would soon be in control of Europe. November 1941, just before America entered the war, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt attacked a group of American entrepreneurs.
The all-inclusive whole of our vast industrial machine. That output cannot be hampered by the selfish obstruction of any small minority. A small but dangerous minority of industrial managers who perhaps hold out for extra profits or for business as usual.
Standard Oil, later Esso, was the greatest oil colossus in the USA in the 1930s. The company pursued global policies regardless of governments and peoples. Its aim was the creation of monopolies. Standard was part of the Rockefeller Empire. Its head office was in his New York skyscraper. Manager Walter Teagle was said to behave as if he were an emperor. Teagle encountered another giant also aiming to rule the world, IG Farben. And in this German chemical company, there was also a man striving for power, Hermann Schmitz. At first, he was a rival of Standard Oil. IG Farben had developed a method of producing synthetic petrol. Whoever owned the patent would rule the world market in case of an oil shortage. Standard Oil was also obsessed by this fear. It soon came to an agreement with IG Farben. The Germans needed Standard Oil's know-how for the costly production of the synthetic fuel. But Hitler wants war. For strategic reasons, he needs the synthetic petrol no matter what it costs. In war, his supply of oil would soon be cut off. In 1938, Germany is still importing 80% of its crude oil. They considered building pipelines. They considered building a fleet of tankers. But all these plans were blocked from the beginning because Hitler had ruled that the only solution for Germany was to become self-sufficient.
Deutschland richtet sich nur auf die Autarkie.
The wheels for Hitler's war machine need large amounts of rubber. Natural rubber has to be paid for from the limited reserves of foreign currency and will not be available in case of war. Here too, the chemical pioneer IG Farben is able to help. It had developed Buna, a synthetic rubber from lime and coal. In addition to Hitler, there is another interested party, Standard Oil. The company senses a lucrative market, at least in the USA. Standard Oil is not disturbed by the fact that Goering has another market in mind for German petrol and rubber. We knew that we have no fuel, so we built the factories which would give us fuel. We knew that we would be unable to get any rubber, so we built the factories there where they once believed to have monopolies. German science has broken these monopolies, and now, in any case, we are in possession of all those means which we need to vanquish the enemy. Yet Goering's Luftwaffe had forgotten one of these means, the petrol additive lead tetraethyl. Without this, Goering's high-compression aircraft engines would be unable to take off. But Hitler needs a highly efficient air force for his forthcoming invasion of the East. Goering asked the IG Farben bosses to approach the American friends. Standard Oil is the world's leading producer of this additive. The two managers, Walter Tiegel in New York and Hermann Schmitz in Berlin, had already some time ago agreed to build two factories for lead tetraethyl in Germany. In June 1938, however, their production is insufficient. A quick direct supply is to remedy the situation. The Standard Oil subsidiary in London immediately delivers $20 million worth of the anti-knock additive to the Nazis, and this despite the immediate danger of war. Hitler is now able to annex the Sudetenland and prepare his attack on Czechoslovakia. Just before Hitler's invasion of Poland, summer 1939, the English once more supply lead tetraethyl to the value of $15 million. With this, the first blitz attacks against England can be launched. The war intensifies Hitler's dependence on oil. The synthetic production in Germany supplies only half of what is needed. Once again, he needs the American friends. Standard Oil owns almost half of the shares in the Romanian oil fields of Ploiești. These are Germany's most important source of crude oil. Distrustful as Hitler is, he represses the Romanians. They are to keep a low profile in the oil company Romano-Americana, in which they are shareholders, and leave the protection of the oil fields to the German Air Force. But Hitler needs more.
Also aus einem Schriftwechsel, der im Militärarchiv in Freiburg liegt.
Well, from correspondence preserved in a military archive in Freiburg, it's clear that the Nazis desperately needed bright stock, and that only the USA could supply this. And the supply was absolutely vital for the war and had to take place during the war. And indeed, during the war, bright stock was delivered from the USA, as far as I know, in a quantity sufficient for the entire duration of the war. Bright stock is a high-quality oil product, used, for example, for tank engines. The Third Reich still needs petrol and diesel from the USA. The ships of the American friends now bunker oil in the Caribbean. Most of the tankers fly the Panamanian flag. In the Atlantic, British warships lie in wait, trying to torpedo Hitler's oil supply with a sea blockade.
Die Marine scheint mir ein Sonderfall zu sein.
The Navy seems to me to be a special case, because they made direct deals with the USA and also with the Caribbean states. This is a case where we can prove direct deals. Not in the form of invoices, but in the form of memos, which prove quite clearly that the deals were clinched. It was also known that these were German-American deals paid for with horrendous sums of foreign money, that the prices rose during the war, and this had the seal of approval from the highest level.
Und dass das auch von höchster Stelle genehmigt war.
For high-quality diesel fuel, the commander-in-chief of the Navy is able to demand a quick $500,000 from the limited supply of foreign currency. Hitler wants to rule the Atlantic with his submarines. For this diesel supply, he can also rely on his American friends. Besides Standard Oil, there's also Texaco, whose president is Thorkild Rieber, an American of Norwegian descent and a Hitler friend. He also has contacts to the German Secret Service, whose undercover agents pass on glowing reports about him. They certify him as pro-German and as an honest admirer of the Führer. Via Tenerife and other Spanish ports, the tankers of the blockade breakers supply oil for the Germans on the mainland. They even refuel German submarines on the open sea off the Spanish coast. Even after America has entered the war, Standard Oil still delivers petrol to the two Nazi airlines, Condor and Lati. Their planes transport spies, gold and foreign currency to Latin America and bring back precious metals, vital for the war.
On September 22nd, 1939, following the outbreak of World War II, IG Farben and Standard Oil had agreed that they would maintain a relationship regardless if the United States entered the war.
Den Haag, beginning of September 39. Managers from IG Farben and Standard Oil conclude a secret agreement. IG Farben wants to prevent the confiscation of its patents by hostile overseas countries. They seem to be safe in the hands of the US company. When the Buna patent for artificial rubber is handed over, Standard Oil has to agree, at the insistence of the Reich Ministry for Economic Affairs, only to use the patent with the permission of the Germans. Manager Tegel consents to the deal. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor triggers the war in the Pacific. Now the Americans are cut off from their most important rubber supplier, Malaysia. Despite a shortage of rubber in the USA, Standard Oil sticks to its agreement with the Germans. The Buna patent is not to fall into the hands of rivals such as Goodyear. The influential Senator Baruch, assigned by President Roosevelt to investigate the affair, appeals to the nation.
We find that the existing rubber situation to be so dangerous that unless corrective measures are taken immediately, this country will face both a military and a civilian collapse.
At the same time, in the land of oil surplus, petrol has to be rationed. Many Americans, including members of Congress, blame the oil companies who continue to deliver to the Nazis and keep the rubber patents under wraps. Senator Harry Truman, later to become president, responds to public pressure by setting up a Senate committee to investigate the defense situation. He is supported by Thurman Arnold, the cartel specialist in the Ministry of Justice. Standard Oil and its powerful bosses have long been a thorn in his flesh. He had already tried in vain to impose a fine on them of $50,000 for doing business with the enemy. By claiming that they were indispensable for America in wartime, the managers had succeeded in reducing the fine to $1,000. In the Senate hearing, Arnold accuses Standard Oil of holding back the rubber patents and of a continued conspiracy in favor of the Nazis. In a subsequent press conference, Truman speaks of betrayal. As a result of a decision by Congress, the Buna patents are released for America. The mighty Tegel is a broken man and resigns from the management. The Führer and the Opel Blitz were inseparable comrades. Hitler and his soldiers needed it for the advance, and later for the retreat. Hitler inspired Opel. What that meant was clear: achievement, order, loyalty. As early as the 1930s, Opel, the subsidiary of the American company General Motors, begins to build military trucks. For the time being, however, in 1935, Hitler is not talking of war. He wants the Volkswagen, the people's car.
Die Ausstellung war beherrscht von dem Willen des Führers.
The exhibition was dominated by the Führer's demand, create the German Volkswagen. Opel believes it already has it, the P4, the cheapest small car of its time. The company tries to get the government contract, but fails. Hitler wants a vehicle that can also be used for military purposes, that the people can use for their excursions into the expanses of Europe by paying 5 marks a month. The bucket car becomes the most popular VW model. Nevertheless, Opel is allowed to construct its Volkswagen, the Blitz. In 1935, after negotiations with the Wehrmacht, it builds the truck factory in Brandenburg. The Opel management, which at that time also included the Americans, is quick to recognize the lucrative business prospects offered by military contracts. Built for the new American production methods, the plant is the most modern in Europe. Every day, 120 trucks leave the conveyor belt.
Es war also dieser Opel Blitz das Rückgrat der Wehrmacht.
It was this Opel Blitz, the backbone of the Wehrmacht, produced by Opel, and this is quite clear, with American money.
Amerikanische Gelder gebaut.
Without the Blitz, Hitler would not even have got as far as Vienna. When the Germans advance to Austria, numerous vehicles from other companies break down. Overnight, hundreds of Opel Blitzes are requisitioned in Bavaria near the border so that the Wehrmacht can march into the Austrian capital. Hitler is grateful. He visits the factory in Brandenburg and orders a further 2,000 Opel Blitzes. In the 30s and at the beginning of the war, one American is particularly active in taking care of GM property in Germany, James D. Mooney, vice president of the company. In 1938, for his services in furthering Opel's development as a leading ordnance factory, Hitler awards him the Order of the German Eagle, the party's highest distinction for foreigners. Wherever it is deployed, the Opel Blitz passes all tests with flying colors. In the conquests in the East, in the annexation of the Sudetenland, and in the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and also in the Blitz campaigns in the West. Within a few weeks, in 1940, Holland, Belgium, and France are defeated. When the war begins, the production of private cars in Rüsselsheim virtually grinds to a halt. The machines lie idle, the number of workers diminishes as they are called up to serve in the Wehrmacht. The factory wants to stop this development, and the Luftwaffe also has a new use for Rüsselsheim. Opel now produces basic assembly parts and engines for the Ju-88, Hitler's most important bombers.
Grundsätzlich war schon wenige Tage nach
Basically, only a few days after the outbreak of war, close cooperation had been organized between the Luftwaffe and the factory in Rüsselsheim. This had been also supported by a visit from Vice President Mooney, who was not only corresponding with the Nazi leaders, but was also present at the time in Berlin. He came to Rüsselsheim and also then met Göring.
Mit der NS-Führung, sondern zu der Zeit auch in Berlin anwesend war, hier nach Rüsselsheim gekommen ist und schließlich mit Göring auch zusammengetroffen ist.
In his talk with Göring, Mooney expresses a certain understanding for the policies of the Nazis. He also believes that after the First World War, Germany had been treated too harshly by France and England. Göring encourages Mooney to mediate between the belligerents. Mooney approaches President Roosevelt, and the latter agrees to be prepared to act as a moderator. Roosevelt wishes Mooney good luck for his mission. Berlin, February 1940. With a flattering letter to the dear Reich Chancellor, Mooney gains access to Hitler in his new Reich Chancellery. In a diary which was never published due to objections by GM, he records his talk with Hitler. In his report to Roosevelt, he describes Hitler as warm and friendly. However, Roosevelt is unimpressed by the Führer's megalomaniac demand that Nazi Germany be recognized as a world power. Mooney has played out his role as a useful idiot. After this, Messerschmitt, the Under-Secretary of State in the State Department, calls Mooney a fascist. The strange episode concerning the Nazi friend Mooney had no influence on the course of history. Opel continued to build military vehicles, over 100,000 in the war years, urgently needed due to the high losses. In 1941, General von Schell, Hitler's director of mechanization, confirmed that without this company, war could never have been waged. Meanwhile, the Battle of Britain had been lost. Nor was Opel able to produce the Ju-88s at the speed with which they plummeted from the skies. This has a positive effect on the profits. In the party and in the ministries, this arouses envy and resentment. In 1941, GM refuses an offer to sell Opel and to withdraw from Germany. In a letter to the Reich Commissioner for Enemy Properties, GM reports that it has just begun to identify with Germany's fate. Behind this, however, is a financial consideration. GM had just claimed a tax deduction in the USA for its property in Germany and had thus earned $22 million. If the Reich had compensated GM, it would have had to pay tax for this.
During the first 2 years of the Second World War, the American management remained in place until around the middle of 1941, where they started getting very nervous and getting Americans out. So the executive boards of these American companies were still run by Americans. It was American CEOs who were going to the German Rüstungskommando and figuring out what quota of trucks are we supposed to provide, how many forced laborers do we need, how are you going to get us the labor and the material, where do we fit in your overall production scheme. They saw that their customer had certain needs, and they set out to meet those needs as efficiently as possible.
Meanwhile, GM is earning huge profits on American armaments, which are now being organized by Mooney. As a high-ranking reserve officer, he sees himself as a patriot. Mooney's boss, Sloan, explains the business philosophy behind this. An international enterprise which is operating throughout the world should carry out its activities in accordance with strictly economic criteria, regardless of the political views of the country in which it is operating. We are no charity organization. We make profits for our shareholders.
Wir sagten mal, das ist doch ein Witz, nicht? Dass hier werden die LKWs hergestellt, womit die Amerikaner bekämpft werden.
We said that must be a joke. Here the trucks are being produced, which are used to fight the Americans. Yes, that's how it was. And still there was no attack. And so we said, sure, after all, the Americans are not so stupid that they destroy their own factory.
In eigene Fabrik in Trümmer werfen.
The Americans are not so stupid. The Brandenburg plant is almost completely destroyed by American bombers on August 6, 1944. Years later, however, GM receives $32 million as compensation from the American taxpayer. In 1921, Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, was published in a German translation. Between Henry Ford, the legendary automobile manufacturer, and Adolf Hitler, there existed from an early date a spiritual affinity, anti-Semitism. Ford's book confirmed Hitler in his hatred of Jews and served as a model for his inflammatory book, Mein Kampf.
In Hitler and in the European fascist dictatorships, the owners of the American economy saw a possible solution to their own problems with their own workers' movement and their own unions. Unions, in Henry Ford's view, were the work of the devil.
Hitler's brutal method of dealing with the unions was highly approved of by Ford, who kept armed militias in his factories. Even before Hitler seized power, Ford supported him financially. The portrait of the benefactor hung in the Munich headquarters of the Nazi Party.
As far as Henry Ford is concerned, he was understood as an inspiration for Hitler at that time. He was much more than this. Henry Ford was a kind of god of mass production, or the Pope, I should say. Thousands of people would write to him every day, "You are the greatest hero. You introduced this factory system that has made America so great." Fordismus became the kind of ideology of the German industrial class. They wanted to do it just like Henry Ford showed them how.
Detroit is still the home of Ford. The factories at Piquet, now industrial ruins, once housed the assembly lines from which rolled Ford's famous Tin Lizzie, the first mass-produced cheap automobile. Cologne, 1930. Henry Ford himself lays the foundation stone for his own factory in Germany. At first, business is not good. His cars are too expensive, and many Germans have an aversion to foreign companies. Any average German car owner who buys a foreign car nowadays cannot claim that the reason was its higher quality. For our German cars can now no longer be beaten by foreign ones. In the early 30s, the Ford plants are not working to full capacity. Cologne and Detroit, where Henry's son Edsel has taken charge, seek a solution. In a confidential paper to Edsel, Cologne points out that in Germany a war economy is developing, in which government contracts will become increasingly important. The Americans have no problem with this. They sell their 8-cylinder as a unit for a military jeep. The Ford plants begin to toe the Nazi line. Detroit also goes along with the next concession. The foreign automobile manufacturers are no longer allowed any rubber for tires, nor do they get any foreign currency for import. They have to obtain rubber by means of an exchange deal and have to hand over 25% of the imported rubber to the Nazis for armament purposes. Hitler, friend of the factory, is grateful. Finally, Ford cars from Cologne are permitted to use a stamp of quality German product. Business with the government thrives. In 1938, Ford and Opel are included in the plans of the Wehrmacht, which quickly needs 100,000 trucks, among them heavy traxial trucks and chain-driven vehicles. The Nazis are in a great hurry. In 1938, they want 1,000 trucks at once from Ford. The Cologne plant can't deliver so quickly. The Americans are eager to help out. They apparently have no misgivings. The engines, chassis and cabins of the trucks delivered by Detroit are put together secretly at night in Cologne and then picked up at daybreak by the Wehrmacht.
Just at the moment when the entire world is focused on Czechoslovakia and the Nazi drive to blackmail Czechoslovakia and move into the Sudetenland, just at that moment, the Nazi military comes to Ford and says, we need 1,000 trucks now. And, I'm going to ask you, does it seem plausible to you that Ford does not know what these 1,000 trucks are for?
The commission was no secret to Ford. The Nazis had even paid for part of the delivery with precious dollars, but Ford only admitted this decades later. Hitler had already awarded Henry Ford the Order of the German Eagle for services rendered. At the end of 1938, Ford has it pinned to his lapel by the German vice consul in Detroit. Ford now also shows his appreciation for the lucrative business deals. On Hitler's 50th birthday, on the 20th of April 1939, the company transfers 35,000 Reichsmarks to the donation fund AH. During the first years of the war, the production of trucks increases dramatically. There's no record of Henry Ford protesting against this. When Henry Ford hears that the plant in Dearborn is to produce 6,000 engines for the British Royal Air Force, he objects. He only accepts commissions for the defense of the USA, he writes to the London Daily Mail. Yet Ford has no objection to the fact that the French plants under the German occupation regime are working flat out for the Wehrmacht and producing 1,000 trucks a month. The boss of Ford France, Maurice Dollfus, wants to keep the plant for the Ford family. He resists the influence of the Cologne plant and feels himself directly responsible to the Fords, father and son. Even after America's entry into the war, he sends Edsel Ford reports of the plant's success. As late as June 1942, Edsel Ford thanks Dollfus for his exemplary work. In Cologne, Ford is only able to produce the supplies for the Wehrmacht with the help of forced laborers. They are put up in their own barracks on the factory grounds. In the later war years, Ford also employs thousands of inmates from concentration camps who can be hired from the SS for 4 marks a day. Their living and working conditions are brutal.
А на фабрике был один полицай, он был фашист. Тут у него фашистский знак был такой.
In the factory there were police. There was a Nazi. He wore a kind of badge. He had a swastika here. He was nasty, disgusting. He hated us, the Russians.
Russische Schweine, russische Schweine.
Russian swine. That's what he always shouted at us. I got beaten up when I went to the night shift. I was all of 2 minutes late. The Nazi threw my girlfriend down the iron staircase. She was unconscious. A punch on the head, that's nothing. To them, we weren't human beings.
По голове стукнуть это ничего не стоит. Мы же не люди.
Now that the USA has entered the war, Ford is a fervent patriot. His factories now produce aircraft, trucks, tanks, and ships for America's victory. By the end of the war, the Ford plant in Cologne has produced 78,000 Wehrmacht trucks and 14,000 chain-driven vehicles. Cologne has been bombed by the Allies since 1942 and is almost entirely destroyed. Until the end of 1944, the Ford plant is spared, and then it's only slightly damaged. In 1965, Ford demands $7 million from the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. This is reduced to the amount of $500,000 due to the fact that the company had used fraudulent methods in calculating the alleged damages. The precursor of the present-day computer was also produced by IBM in Germany by the company's own DEHOMAG, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinen AG. Using punch cards, they were able to tabulate figures for statistics, various entries and calculations, and to print out the results very quickly. I ask you, are you determined to follow the Führer in fighting for victory through all adversity and to accept even the most onerous personal burdens? In the audience, one person applauded Goebbels with particular enthusiasm, Albert Speer. Appointed by Hitler as Minister of Armaments in 1942, he has to do all in his power to secure victory, which after the loss of the Battle of Britain and the first hard war winter in Russia seems ever more remote. Within a short time, he doubled and trebled the war production. For this, the Führer awarded him a medal. Speer organized the mechanized information system. He was no great believer in bureaucracy, but he appreciated all the more the importance of organization. This system was a far-flung control and surveillance apparatus which could only function with the help of the Hollerith machines. It gave Speer an exact monthly overview of the state of the economy and enabled him to take immediate action. It was his weapon of command. The swiftly compiled monthly report on the war production, produced with punch cards, was secret Reich information and was limited to 12 copies. They revealed at once demands of the military forces, state of the armaments production, consumption and stocks of raw materials, energy reserves, and the number of the existing or required labor skills, including the forced laborers and their origin. Hitler's seizure of power triggered a huge upswing for the German IBM subsidiary. Although the machines were already in use in most large companies, it was now the government which was to become one of the most important clients. In 1935, DEHOMAG already built a large new factory in Berlin-Lichterfelde.
Mit der Aufrüstung von Hitler, da haben wir ja unheimlich
With Hitler's rearmament, we got an incredible number of commissions and new clients.
finanziell und auch sonst ging es.
We were doing great, not only financially, also in other respects. And right at the beginning, we got a huge poster that was stuck on the wall.
Betrieb der deutschen
Model factory of the German Workers' Front.
leisten können.
And so we could prove that we were really able to do a great deal to support Hitler's state. That was the reason for this currying favor.
Anbietung.
IBM President Thomas Watson is also impressed by the success of DEHOMAG. He enjoys traveling to Germany and does so often. In the summer of 1937, the International Chamber of Commerce holds its World Congress in Berlin. Watson is elected president. At the festive ceremony in the Kroll Opera, according to a report in the New York Times, Watson is one of the foreigners who raises his right arm for the Hitler salute when the latter arrives. But he only raises his arm halfway, then lowers it again. The next day he's received by the Führer. Watson was regarded as an admirer of Adolf Hitler's, whom he had already supported before he seized power.
Ich habe das Gefühl gehabt, dass wir zu diesem Zeitpunkt mit der Regierung und mit der
I had the feeling that at the time we had a good relationship with the government.
festgestellt,
Watson had said in public, and then it went through the press,
also
that Hitler was doing the right thing with his plans,
auf dem richtigen
and that everything would be fine.
bestens werden sollte.
And that was, of course, okay with us.
Es war natürlich recht dabei.
Watson was also awarded the Führer's Order of the German Eagle. The ceremony was conducted by Hjalmar Schacht, then still the Nazis' Minister for Financial Affairs. Watson continues to believe that Germany is taking the right steps. Even after the Kristallnacht, when the Nazis launch extremely brutal attacks on the Jews. And even though the American press leaves no doubt as to the true aim of the Nazis, the extermination of the Jews, Dänemark is to help achieve this end. Swiftly it carries out its hitherto biggest government assignment. It's their machines which conduct the great census of 1939, with which the racial fanatics of the SS want to find out how many Jews live in Germany, the Sudetenland and Austria. On a second card, the so-called supplementary card, name and address have to be filled out. Also race and descent of parents and grandparents. The racial administration of the SS thus wants to register all details of full Jews, half Jews and quarter Jews. This has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with race.
Die IBM war immer neutral.
IBM was always
Jetzt
neutral
sind diese Dinge
and hardly ever interfered in these things.
sagte, wenn die irgendwie
Because if I want to persuade someone of something, then I'll always offend someone else. Nobody wanted to do that at Dänemark.
Geschäftspolitik.
Business policy, of course. With the invasion of Poland begins the policy of extermination in the east. Krakow becomes the capital of what has been declared the general government of the occupied Polish areas. Karl Hermann Frank, Hitler's brutal governor, takes up residence in the former palace of Krakow. The law and order zealots also see here a task for the Hollerith machines. In Krakow, a large statistics office is set up. Watson's emissaries are also on site. The IBM office in Warsaw is renamed Watson Business Machines. By means of punch cards, economic data are to be compiled, and the Poles registered as forced laborers. Yet the chaotic Nazi administration is too inefficient to complete this task accurately. The extermination of the Jews has already been carried out beforehand, with the help of old censuses.
Die einzelnen Stellen des Maschinerierechtswesens in Polen, in Österreich, in
The mechanized information offices in Poland, in Austria, in France, etc., they were all occupied or run by IBM people, our people. They had all been transferred there, and so they did the work there. 1943, the shortage of labor hinders the war production. Armaments Minister Speer wants to mobilize the last reserves. Now even concentration camp inmates are to be registered according to work skills, and after matching them up with labor needs in the Reich, they are set to work. Hollerith registration offices are set up, as in the Stutthof camp.
Hollerith Abteilung KL Stutthof war Nummer 12.
Und organisiert.
Hollerith Department Stutthof was number 12. And I organized a group of clerks, about 14 to 16 men, who had to fill out all the cards of all the prisoners.
Von ganzen Häftlinge, aber allen, dass wir da geschrieben haben.
The most important thing was that we noted the work skill. This was very important for the production.
Zur Produktion.
The information from the prisoners' cards was transferred to Hollerith cards in the Berlin SS headquarters. Each concentration camp had its own number code, which was also part of the inmate's number. It's estimated that over 1 million inmates were registered as forced laborers. Most of their cards were destroyed. About 140,000 are still preserved in the Federal Archive in Berlin-Hoppegarten. To what extent the Hollerith system was used in the extermination camps is not clear. IG Farben, however, did order Hollerith machines for its factory in the extermination camp of Auschwitz-Monowitz. In view of the increasing reports of Nazi crimes, Watson returns his Nazi award in the summer of 1940. His reputation in America is more important to him than the vicious tirades of the Führer. Watson seems to have fallen from grace. Wilhelm Heidinger, his German junior partner, who together with 2 others has a 15% share in the company, takes advantage of this to reduce the influence of the Americans.
Heidinger sagte dann den Amerikanern, irgendwie wird es schief gehen.
Heidinger then said to the Americans that this would somehow go wrong. With our machines, we control almost the entire German economy. We have insight into everything, into the bookkeeping, what goes on behind the scenes, etc. And the party won't tolerate that. Sooner or later, they'll take us over. And indeed, the Mechanized Information Office and SS Brigadier Edmund Wesenmeyer, also one of Hitler's advisors, are uneasy about the insight which Dehomag IBM has gained due to its omnipresence. Under the motto, "Anything is right if it's of use to the German people," Wesenmeyer advises that the company be taken over by the state. But Watson doesn't give up so quickly. In 1940, he sends his confidant Harrison Chauncey to Berlin, who not only negotiates with Dehomag boss Heidinger, but also, quite blatantly, with SS-man Wesenmeyer. He sends his reports to New York in code via the American embassy. In the course of the negotiations, Wesenmeyer becomes more conciliatory. The Nazis need IBM for their armaments industry. Instead of nationalization, IBM is to agree to becoming a minority shareholder. Acting in accordance with Watson, Chauncey also rejects this proposal, with the explanation that if the Germans win the war, then Europe is open to us, and if they lose the war, then we carry on as before. When America enters the war, the Nazis refrain from expropriating the company and appoint a Dehomag executive as trustee for IBM. Watson is jubilant. In this way, IBM remains the owner of the German Dehomag for the rest of the war. The American Ministry of Justice is increasingly suspicious of IBM's position in Germany. Harold Carter, a ministry official in charge of economic warfare, starts to compile an overview on the activities of IBM in Germany and Europe, the Carter Report of 1943. In an anonymous attachment, evidently from a frustrated IBM employee in Europe, the company is described as an international monster and as in a class with the Nazis. The report has no consequences.
The ones who stayed won the game. They got to build the German war machine before the war. They got to destroy the German war machine during the war as contractors to the American military and the Pentagon. And then they got to come back in as the military officials who controlled German industry after the war.
As early as 1943, Tax Inspector Hiller from the tax office in Berlin-Brandenburg named Opel, Ford and Hollerith as the companies which had already made huge profits. Since dividends and profits could not be transferred overseas, they were used to stock up the company's capital. The shareholders suffered no reprisals. On the contrary. Eleanor Roosevelt, widow of the president, was horrified when she heard that the shareholders had profited because the Ford plants in Germany and France had collaborated with the Nazis. On September the 19th, 1945, she wrote in the New York Times, "Business complications do strange things to our patriotism and to our ethics."
Business Insider, Military and Defense. And it says, 9 Nazi scientists who helped build the American space program. As World War II drew to a close, the United States rushed to collect as many former Nazi scientists as possible through a secret mission called Operation Paperclip. As some had been branded war criminals at Nuremberg, the US military whitewashed the background of many scientists in an attempt to justify hiring them. Knowing that trouble was brewing already with the Soviet Union, these scientists were employed by the US in a wide variety of roles, including at times experimenting with LSD. Below are some of the most influential former Nazis who played unquestionably large roles in America's emerging technological dominance during the Cold War. And they're talking about NASA, creation of NASA. As you can see, Business Insider. Okay, and it says, Werner Magnus Maximilian was a German, later American aerospace engineer and space architect, credited with inventing the V-2 rocket for Nazi Germany and the Saturn V for the United States. He was the leading figure in the development of rocket technology in Germany and father of rocket technology and space science in the United States. Following World War II, he was secretly moved to the United States, along with 1,500 other scientists, engineers, and technicians as part of Operation Paperclip. Military career, allegiance, Nazi Germany, service branch, SS. Werner Dahn. To his credit, Dahn opposed the Nazis, it says here. Sure. Resisted joining the party to give him no other option. So it says, after Paperclip, Dahn made huge contributions to the US space race. He worked on the Saturn V booster rocket, aerothermodynamics, and liquid hydrogen propellant system. For his work, he became chief of the Aerophysics Division of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center before becoming chief aerodynamicist at NASA Center. Herman H. Kurwik was a chief researcher and deputy director of the B-2 rocket program. After Paperclip, Kurwik became technical director of Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Maryland, where he continued his aerodynamics and aeroballistics research. Later, he became a chief researcher at NASA, investigating aerodynamics and flight mechanics. Konrad Dannenberg worked closely with von Braun, helping develop the B-2 rocket. He also helped organize and launch the first object ever to be sent into space by humans. After Paperclip, Dannenberg continued to work closely on his former subjects. He helped the United States to produce rocket engines and missiles. Eventually, he also became deputy manager of the Saturn program, which focused on creating engines for launching both satellites and space shuttles into space. So far, you see what I'm talking about, right? Kurt Heinrich Debus. Debus was another member of the SS who helped work on and produce V-2 rockets for the Nazis. He was closely associated with von Braun and was responsible for leading the testing of the V-2 rockets. After the war, Debus became a prime asset for NASA. His accomplished work on a variety of programs, including launching satellites and the eventual moon mission, led to him becoming the first ever director of the Kennedy Space Center. Walter Robert Dornberger says Dornberger was a major general in the army of the Third Reich. He was a senior artillery commander and had personal contact with Hitler. Okay, you see who this person is? His real passion and skills lay in engineering, and he was foundational in the development of the rockets for the Nazis. After the war, Dornberger continued his engineering research for the U.S. He spent time developing guided missile systems for the U.S. military before becoming the vice president of the Bell Aircraft Corporation. Bell. He developed Bell's Raskol, the first guided nuclear air-to-surface missile. You see that? That's Hitler's boy. Eberhard Friedrich Michael Ries. Ries was another researcher focused on the development of the B-2 rocket for the Third Reich, although reportedly Ries' passion always lay with space. After the war, Ries managed to follow his passions. He developed a blade of heat shields for NASA, and he became the deputy director of development operations for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. He also directed the Lunar Roving Vehicle Program before becoming the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. Ernst Stullinger started his career as a Nazi soldier. He fought in the Battle of Moscow and Battle of Stalingrad before being shifted into research. Eventually, he came to work on guidance systems under von Braun. After the Paperclip, Stullinger was brought in as director. He was brought in as director right away of the Advanced Research Projects Division of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. He also contributed greatly to the space race, as he was one of the pioneers of electric propulsion. He also worked on the initial phases of the Hubble telescope. Hubertus Stronghold says Stronghold, pay attention now, has been accused of participating in extensive human experimentation under the Third Reich, though it has never been proven. Yeah, right, obviously you know why it hasn't been proven. The experiments he allegedly oversaw included performing surgery without anesthetic and depriving people of oxygen in vacuum compartments, as well as human experiments related to hypothermia. These experiments were meant to determine the effects of high altitude and supersonic flights on human beings. After the war, Strughold helped to pioneer the field of space medicine. He was vital in the investigation into the effects of weightlessness on people, as well as overseeing the buildings of space cabin simulators at NASA. Strughold also played a central role in designing the pressure suit and onboard life support systems used by Gemini and Apollo astronauts.